Mr. President, I rise today to join my colleagues in opposing Betsy DeVos to serve as the Secretary of Education. Our nation recognized early in its history that public education is a necessary foundation for our democracy. It is critical that we continue to support a strong public education system that prepares all of our young people to participate in our democracy and compete in the 21st century workforce. All public officials, regardless of their party affiliation, should share a reverence for the importance of public education to our country's success, both now and into the future. And they must show a commitment to enforcing our laws so that all students have the opportunity to succeed. I agree with my colleagues that Mrs. DeVos has not shown a commitment to or an understanding of these principles, and that's why I oppose her nomination. This nomination process has been extremely disappointing from the start. Mrs. DeVos failed to provide critical information on her finances. Members of the Help Committee were only given 5 minutes to question Mrs. DeVos on her views on our nation's education system. In the questions she did not answer before the committee, Mrs. DeVos demonstrated a complete lack of experience in, knowledge of, and support for public education. She was unable to address basic issues any New Hampshire school board member could discuss fluently. She showed that she lacks an understanding of issues facing students with disabilities. She has potential conflicts of interest that she still has not answered basic questions about. She supports diverting taxpayer dollars to private schools without accountability requirements. As governor of New Hampshire, I supported public schools. They play an important role in driving innovation in education and providing additional opportunities for non-traditional learners. But they must meet the same standards as other public schools. In Detroit, Mrs. DeVos led efforts to oppose accountability requirements, even for for-profit charter schools. And in her testimony before the Help Committee, she declined to support enforcing accountability requirements. It is clear that Mrs. DeVos would pursue policies that would undermine public schools in my home state of New Hampshire and across our nation. In the past several weeks, thousands of Granite Staters, including students, parents, teachers, principals, and superintendents, have called and written into my office. They have shared their concerns about Mrs. DeVos. They understand that she is completely unqualified for this position. Mr. President, our children, their families, and our nation deserve better than a Secretary of Education who does not value public education. Ensuring access to public education for every student is an issue that is deeply personal to my family. Shortly after my husband Tom and I welcomed our first child into the world, our son Ben, we found out that he had severe and pervasive physical disabilities. It became clear to Tom and me that we were going to need a little bit of extra help if our son was going to have the kind of future we all want our children to have. And we were lucky because we found that help in our community, not only among friends and neighbors, but in a public school system that welcomed Ben. I still remember the day that a school bus pulled into our driveway, and we went onto the lift and up into the bus, and off he went at age 3 to his first day of preschool, publicly funded, inclusive preschool. And as I sat on the stoop and watched the bus pull away, I found myself thinking that if Ben had been born a generation or two earlier, Tom and I would have been pressured to put Ben in an institution. There wouldn't have been the resources in our community or in our school system to include Ben. But because of the work of the champions, the families, the advocates who went before the Hassan family, Ben was able to go to school in his hometown. He was able to learn and to make friends, to do what we all want our children to do. That's the power of public education. It's the power of making sure that all kids are included. Our family was able to live like any other family and feel like any other family because Ben could go to school in his hometown. And as Ben went from preschool to elementary school to middle school to high school, we found that his peers accepted him, interacted with him, grew with him. I still remember a day when I got a call from one of Ben's teachers saying that the tire on his power wheelchair had gone flat. Now, that's the type of call that a parent of a child with complex needs dreads, because it means you have to stop everything, because if the wheelchair can't move, your child can't go through their day. But instead of my needing to take a day off from work and pursue the repair of Ben's chair, it was other students in our Career and Technical Education Center in Exeter who came forward and said, we can fix that. Their education, preparing them for a trade and a career, served Ben's needs that day beautifully, and both Ben and his peers learned that day. Ben's experience in public education was made possible because of so many advocates, educators, and families that came before our family. But this was not always the case for students who experience disabilities. When I served in the state Senate in New Hampshire, I grew to know a woman named Roberta. Roberta, born in the early 1950s, had spent a good portion of her life in our state's school for individuals with disabilities. Roberta left that state school as we began to work after the passage of the IDEA to bring people out of institutions and into the communities. And later, as Roberta learned to advocate for herself and tell her story, she recorded some of her memories from Laconia State School, the separate school, so-called school, for students with disabilities. Roberta wrote, and this is a quote, "Some of the attendants and residents at the Laconia State School sexually, verbally, emotionally, and physically abused and assaulted me. The staff said they did this to me because I misbehaved or acted silly." She went on, quote, "The attendants and residents there hit and kicked me with their hands and feet. They whipped me with wooden or metal coat hangers, wet towels, hairbrushes, mop and broom handles, hard leather belts, straps, rulers, and yardsticks, stainless steel serving utensils, and clothes." Roberta adds, quote, "Additionally, they bullied me by laughing at me and calling me names. They spat at me, bit and pinched my arms and other body parts, causing me pain. The employees and supervisors at the institution threw buckets of cold water on my body, clothes and all. They said that the cold water would calm me down." Roberta's experience was, unfortunately, what life was like for some students with disabilities before IDEA. Years later, after Roberta left Laconia State School, after she was reintegrated into her community, she appeared before a state Senate committee that I was chairing because she was the main proponent of a law that we passed in the New Hampshire State Senate to remove the word retarded from all of our state statutes, because Roberta knew that it was the judgment of people who first interacted with her, people who believed she had intellectual disabilities, that caused her parents to believe that they had to put not only Roberta, but her sister Jocelyn in an institution. Both Roberta and Jocelyn happened to have the misfortune of being born with disabilities. It is that contrast between Roberta's experience and my son's that focused on the importance of making sure that we include all children in our public school system, but also that we have the laws in place to ensure that they get the free, appropriate education that all American children deserve. Unfortunately, Mr. President, Mrs. DeVos has demonstrated a lack of understanding of the challenges facing students with disabilities. At our hearing earlier this month, I questioned Mrs. DeVos on whether she would enforce IDEA. Not only did she decline to assure senators that she would enforce the law to protect students with disabilities, but she was confused about whether IDEA was indeed a federal law to begin with. While I am pleased that Mrs. DeVos later clarified that she is no longer confused about whether IDEA is a federal law, she has done nothing to reassure me that she would enforce it or that she understands how fragile the gains we have made under IDEA are. The voucher system that Mrs. DeVos supports has often, intended or not, hurt individuals who experience disabilities. Children and families lose legal protections enshrined in the IDEA. In some cases, students and their families have to sign away their civil rights before they can receive their vouchers. Yet many of the private schools that take those vouchers, the schools that Mrs. DeVos wishes to push students to, lack basic resources or accommodations for children who experience disabilities. So if a family determines that the school that has accepted their voucher really doesn't have the resources or expertise to educate their child, they have no legal recourse. Mrs. DeVos's unfamiliarity with IDEA, her comments on students with disabilities, was something my office heard about often from Granite State parents who contacted the office with concerns about her nomination. A mother from Hopkinton, New Hampshire, wrote to tell me about her daughter, who attends Hopkinton High School and experiences severe disabilities, is nonverbal, and requires assistance for all aspects of her daily care. This mother wrote, and here this is a quote, "Despite all of this, because of the extraordinary support we have received, she is living a rich and loving life at home and as part of the public school system. I have no confidence that Betsy DeVos would understand or support the role that public schools have for taking care of all students." This mother also called Mrs. DeVos's lack of understanding of IDEA appalling. I also heard from a parent from Concord, New Hampshire, who said, quote, "My stepdaughter currently has a 504 plan for both a physical and a cognitive disability at Concord High School, who, incidentally, are doing an excellent job of working with her to make sure her learning needs are met. My children deserve a future, and so do all children." This parent said she was feeling, again, this is a quote, "vulnerable" as a result of Mrs. DeVos's nomination. Parents across our nation deserve to know that the rights of their children will be protected, and they are rightfully concerned with Mrs. DeVos's nomination. In New Hampshire, I'm proud of our work to build a future where every child can get the kind of education they need to be competitive and successful leaders in the 21st century economy. Just last week, I visited Sauhegan High School in Amherst, New Hampshire. Sauhegan has become a pioneer in competency-based education. I visited numerous classrooms where students were doing hands-on lessons in earth science and in literature to make sure that they could master the material before them in a way that would stick with them. They were great examples of what we've learned about the importance of hands-on project-based learning, how much better students retain information, knowledge, problem-solving skills when they actually have a problem to solve, and how important it is for them to learn to collaborate with their fellow students, just the way we expect people to collaborate as a team in the workplace. After I visited the classes, the students at Sauhegan had formed a panel to talk with me, and their students with a variety of interests, backgrounds, education levels talked about how important it was for them to have control of their own learning, to learn in a way, in a style that worked for them, to work with their peers and build off of each other's strengths and learn from each other. I also talked with them about New Hampshire's project-based competency assessment program called PACE, something that New Hampshire received waivers to do over the last year and are in the process of continuing right now. New Hampshire is piloting a program that moves us away, just as was recommended and foreseen by the Every Child Succeeds Act, from high-stakes one-time testing to project-based assessments that are built in to the project-based competency learning that they are doing. We are seeing great success with this pilot, and schools across the country are beginning to adopt it as well. That's the power of strong, innovative public education. This was an approach developed by teachers and parents and students and our Department of Education and our statewide school board as well as local school boards together. And just as we have important initiatives surrounding project-based learning in New Hampshire, we also have strong public charter schools. I still recall a visit to our North Country Charter School in one of the more rural parts of New Hampshire, a school that was formed, a regional effort, to allow students for whom traditional high school wasn't working, whether it be because of their learning style, because of particular events that were happening in their home, or other emotional or developmental issues. It allows them to come together and go to school in a way and in a place that works for them, keeping them in school, helping New Hampshire meet its goal set in law that no child drop out before age 18. The strength of the students I saw at the North Country Charter School graduation was extraordinary. Students who had overcome particular challenges, whether it was personal, whether it was academic, speaking for themselves and about themselves and their vision of their own futures to a crowded, excited room of friends and family. That's another kind of public education that supplements our statewide public education system and is something we can work together to do, holding all schools accountable. The vision that Mrs. DeVos, on the other hand, outlined and has devoted much of her work to would dismantle the progress we have made, diverting taxpayer dollars to private, religious, and for-profit schools without accountability requirements. Mrs. DeVos advocates for a voucher system that leaves out students whose families cannot afford to pay additional tuition costs and leaves behind students with disabilities because the schools do not accommodate their complex needs. In his book, Our Kids, Robert Putnam notes that education should be a mechanism to level the playing field. But today, the inequality gap is growing because affluent students start better prepared and are more able to pay. Putnam also points out that daycare and transportation needs constrain the amount of choice that poor parents have when it comes to voucher programs. We should all be working to fix that gap, but the voucher programs that Mrs. DeVos advocates for threaten to increase the gap. The system that Mrs. DeVos advocated for in Detroit, Michigan, has undermined public schools and hurt students in the process. In 2014, Michigan taxpayers spent $1 billion on charter schools, but laws regulating them are weak and the state demands little accountability. The Detroit Free Press reported on the Detroit school system, finding a system where school founders and employees steered lucrative deals to themselves or to other insiders, where schools were allowed to operate for years despite their poor academic records. The Detroit Free Press described a system with no state standards for those who operate charters, and where a record number of charter schools run by for-profit companies refuse to detail how exactly they are spending taxpayer dollars. One Detroit mother said that Mrs. DeVos's, this is a quote, push for charter schools without any accountability exposed my children and their classmates to chaos and unacceptable classroom conditions. In Florida, the McKay Scholarship Program voucher for students with disabilities that Mrs. DeVos has pointed to also raises significant concerns, including no due process rights for students under IDEA, no accountability requirements for participating schools, and absolutely no evidence of student success. Additionally, the McKay voucher often doesn't cover the cost of the private school, leaving parents responsible for tuition and fees above the scholarship amount, not to mention responsibility for transportation. This puts students and their families at risk. Rather than taking the approach we have in New Hampshire, where charter schools supplement a strong public education system, this system of unaccountable schools destabilizes and undermines public schools. Now, given that Mrs. DeVos's goals for K through 12 education are what they are, and the fact that we were only given 5 minutes to question her at the hearing, many key issues facing America's students weren't discussed at all in her confirmation hearing. In particular, we didn't talk about higher education. When I was governor of New Hampshire, I was proud of our work to make college more affordable, building a 21st century workforce pipeline for our businesses. We froze tuition for the first time in 25 years at our public university system, and we actually lowered it at our community colleges. We engaged in increasing and more robust job training efforts where we partnered businesses with community colleges or other learning centers to make sure that we were engaged in the kind of job training that would prepare students for the 21st century economy. So I was hoping that at our hearing for Mrs. DeVos's confirmation, we would discuss higher education. But issues relating to higher education have been lost altogether in this discussion. What is clear, though, is that Mrs. DeVos has absolutely no experience in higher education. Her written responses following our hearing were troubling. On student debt, Pell Grants, reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, and job training efforts, her responses were vague and offered no vision for issues that are critical to millions of Americans. When asked about for-profit colleges, which have had a history of taking advantage of students, including but not limited to our veterans, Mrs. DeVos said she was agnostic, that's her word, about the tax filing status of higher education institutions. That's just not acceptable. I believe we should be expanding Pell Grants. We should lower the interest rates on student loans. We should be expanding apprenticeship and job training opportunities. We need to crack down on predatory for-profit colleges. We need an education secretary who understands and is able to focus on higher education. And it's clear that Mrs. DeVos does not have that experience or focus. Mr. President, our founders understood that public education for our citizens was essential to the functioning of our democracy. In 1786, Thomas Jefferson wrote, and this is a quote, "I think by far the most important bill in our whole code is that for the diffusion of knowledge among the people. No other sure foundation can be devised for the preservation of freedom and happiness." Generation after generation has worked to build on those ideals, including, as we do that work, more and more Americans in the process, and creating a system that gives all students an opportunity to succeed. We need an education secretary who is committed to upholding that principle, not rolling our progress back. And we should all be working together to ensure that we have strong neighborhood public schools, not dismantling them. I join with my colleagues here today and the thousands from my state who have made their voices heard. We need just one more vote to defeat this nomination and to make clear that the United States Senate truly values our nation's public schools. I surely hope that there's another senator willing to break with the president and vote against this woefully unqualified nominee. We all have learned in this wonderful country of ours that with each generation, as we include more and more people who've been marginalized, left out, who weren't counted, that when we include them, we certainly honor their freedom and dignity, important and sufficient, of course, in its own right. But then when we do that, we also unleash the talent and energy of everyone, and that strengthens us all, helps us thrive, helps our economy grow, and makes sure that America not only leads, but deserves to. It's our job in the Senate to listen to the thousands speaking up for our children and the public education system that serves all Americans. Thank you, Mr. President. I suggest the absence of a quorum.